to do it. Oh, I already started it. And
Okay.
now I will present you very briefly. And after that, you will share your talk. Is it works well for you?
That sounds great.
Cool.
Maybe check
So
for
this,
the
sorry?
slides. Check for the slides.
Again? I don't understand you.
Maybe Igor should check for the slides if they work.
Yeah, it's a good idea to check
Yes,
for the slides. Excellent, right. So are your slides working? Yeah, it seems that they're working. Okay, so hi all. This is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Igor Grossman, who is the director of Wisdom and Culture Laboratory. Igor studies psychology and cultural foundations of judgment. He has published in the very, very top journals, including Science, PNAS, Nature, Human Behavior, and much, much more, so I will not list more of them. On top of that, Igor has earned numerous prestigious awards, and he's an elected member of the prestigious College of New Scholars, Scientists, and Artists at the Royal Society of Canada. Okay, so those who are not the first time here knows that we'll proceed as follows. Now Igor will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and then those who have to go can leave, and we will stay for informal discussion of additional 15 to 20 minutes if it's okay with you, Igor. And if it's fine, now the floor is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be part of this group and virtually visiting you wherever you are in different parts of the world. If you ask me about what I would like to talk about, I had some ambitious ideas about a project that is ongoing, and I'll mention that at the very, very end about the Wise Judgment Consortium. But unfortunately, we just started collecting the data, and so I don't really have anything to share. I could speculate about it, and therefore I pivoted a little bit, and instead of that, I will talk about the related project concerning decision-making, judgment, and something that may or may not be related to culture. And well, I hope that it will be stimulating for you. And I also think, like, if there are any clarification questions you have, I know judgment decision-making people are a smart and eager bunch, and you like asking questions. Some of you at business schools, and there people ask questions after the first 2 minutes. So if you have clarification questions, you can always put them either in the chat or even ask me right away. I don't mind. If it's something substantial about how horribly wrong I am about everything that I'm about to present, let's save that until the end. I promise and hope that I will be able to get through this in the next 40 minutes. Okay, so the topic is meta judgment for this particular presentation. And it is, if you want a brief summary of that, it is published in Current Directions in Psych Science. I think it came out last year. It's online first, so very, very fresh off the press, and then really more of an opinion piece in the tradition of Brunswick and Hammond. For those of you who are in the JDM, you know whom I'm talking about. Tries to connect, very much connected to this group, connect the ideas about judgment and refocus away from single shot type of observations, how we make decisions, to intra-individual continuity and intra-individual change in our decision strategies. Let me introduce by basically giving you a very brief example. So, by the way, before I forget, I always forget the important people. So this work would not be possible without Richard Ibach, who has been stimulating me and pushing me. It's my colleague at Waterloo, so I just wanted to highlight him briefly. So let's start with a brief example. So here's Jay, and Jay is facing a variety of decisions in a single day. They start from choosing a colleague to making IT decisions, picking a new computer, selecting an office space, and even participating in a local election. I mean, Jay has a very busy day, like most of us. And Jay's day starts with choosing a new project colleague. And miraculously, in this particular situation, she can choose instead of just having a colleague. And how would she go about it? What will she do? She could be guided by her gut instinct, by her intuition, and choose somebody whom she thinks is likable, or whom she got the immediate impression as being likable and intelligent during the onboarding of that person. Easy choice, quite frequent, typical observation of what we do. Then next, Jay has to pick a computer. Her computer broke down, some virus came, and so now she has to pick a new one. And here Jay is like, I have no idea what I'm doing, don't know what the new best computer is, so let me just consult with the IT department. And the IT officer then makes a recommendation, and Jay just accepts that recommendation without much deliberation and orders a new computer. Very different strategy, just outsource the judgment almost entirely to somebody else that you trust. Okay, then in the afternoon, Jay was lucky, and she had to, she has to pick for the best office. She won the lottery. And she picks, of course, the best office that she can think of, following her preferences, maximizing whatever she considers to be the best. And in this case, it's a coveted corner office with a window, something that some of you probably don't have, at least in Waterloo. Not all offices have windows. Okay, but she basically maximized her preferences here. Again, very different strategy. And last but not least, not that she didn't have enough fun during the day, at the end she has to rush because there's a local election happening. And during this election, she decides to, she has to choose between several candidates. And she decides to choose, she votes for a candidate whose policy would benefit the broader community, being a nice person, and civically minded person, rather than a candidate whose policies would benefit Jay specifically, so which would maximize her personal utility the most. So that's just an example of how typical decisions unfold in everyday life. We sort of like go from one situation to the next, and we are often not very systematic. And it's not like that. I would say we're also not predictably irrational here. We may just attune to very different standards of judgment to different situations. So that's what I want to talk about today. So that I want to talk about what are the standards that we may be thinking are desirable for different situations, and why are we switching between them. And what do I mean by this whole thing is a certain reorientation to this notion of meta-judgment. So essentially, an activity where the judgment itself becomes the object of analysis. And in many ways, it is inspired by an Aristotelian idea of practical wisdom, where essentially the phronesis of practical wisdom was to figure out what fits in what situation and be able to effectively switch from one situation to the next, depending on the demands and depending on what you consider to be the preferred strategy. This sort of like, this is a very sort of naive way to reinterpret Nicomachean ethics, specifically that treatment of practical wisdom. In some ways, what I'm talking about here is how we can apply folk standards of judgment and whether we apply them to everyday decision-making, and also how we use it to evaluate the quality of somebody else's decisions, because it's not just about you, but it's also about other people. And two caveats here. First of all, it's not necessarily the super new idea. There's a lot of meta in psychology these days. There are discussions about meta motivation, and I think that's related. There's about sort of like how do you regulate your goals in such a way that it's effective. There are discussions about folk beliefs in general. That's also kind of related. And I don't think that this is necessarily, I'm reinventing the wheel here. This is just like a framing specifically focusing on judgment decision-making, but it's a discussion, I think, about meta processes that happen across different fields of psychology. The other thing that I would like to highlight is, am I focusing just on some kind of highly deliberate processes? No, because as we know, many type of implicit theories could become habitual and could be applied spontaneously. So this type of form of, if you want, meta judgment does not necessarily require, maybe at the beginning, if you have never applied it, it would require a high degree of deliberation. But over time, it could become a habit and you can apply it spontaneously and maybe rely on some kind of almost like a gut feeling type of sensory information for evaluating whether it's a good standard or not. How exactly that unfolds, we can talk about at the end. I'm just trying to push our focus on these judgmental processes, specifically what I would call here sort of metacognition about judgmental folk theories. And by folk theories specifically, knowledge frameworks that organize and interpret information based on past experiences and learned association, which is the classic theory of that in psychology. Okay, so that's sort of like the setup. Now, from this example that I provided at the beginning, we can say that there are many possible ways how this type of meta judgments could unfold. Some could be focusing on consequences or on some principles. So this is what we often know in moral psychology, like what is the goal of judgment, moral judgment research, are we deontological, are we utilitarian, and so on. Okay, fine. That's one approach to this. But of course, I mentioned several other features that are potentially equally interesting and worth exploring. And maybe to some of you, especially those who believe in System 1 and System 2 as some kind of a dogma, a little bit controversial. So what are the possible other features of judgment and what are the different domains that we can talk about here? From the example already, I highlighted both transactive processes as well as eternal processes. So for instance, if you orient yourself towards somebody else, whom you would get some advice from, well, how would you go about that? Whom would you be paying attention to? Whom would you consider to be the expert in a particular domain? If you focus on the internal processes, well, are you going with your gut feeling or with your deliberation? What would you consider to be the optimal thing to do in a given situation? And if you even focus on the deliberative processes, well, what kind of deliberative process are you focusing on? So are you focusing on some kind of pseudo-rational, highly consistent, logical, top-down analysis, or different forms of deliberation, maybe something related to a sense of reasonableness, something that works, something that's more about satisfying rather than maximizing, something that is about balancing in the ill-defined context, rather this kind of very clear-cut decision tree style that we often describe as rational in the well-defined context. So I want to talk about some of this and provide you with just a few examples over the course of the next 35 minutes or so, and then we can have a discussion. How does that sound? Sounds good? Okay, so first, some examples, and this is from my work, Big Selfish. I mostly focus on work that was done in my lab, but this is also work that has been done in collaboration with many, many people from different parts of the world, and I will be highlighting some of them in a second. Let's start with this kind of question about internal versus transactive processes. So for instance, whom would you be seeking guidance? Would you be seeking guidance from anybody at all when you are making a decision? Is this the right, the wise thing to do in a given situation, especially if you don't have all the pieces of information? Or to put it differently, what are your preferred decision-making strategies, your preferences for ill-defined situations? The other question that one could pursue here is, does this vary across cultures or ecologies? I mean, intuitively, if you would have asked me this question about a decade ago, knowing something from cultural and psychology, cross-cultural research, I would have immediately said that, well, obviously in collectivist societies, it would look very different. Maybe they will rely on others' opinions, and in individualist societies, maybe that is not the case, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, there is a broader question. What do we mean? What collectivist and individualist societies? Also, like, which societies are we talking about? Small scale versus large scale. And more broadly, how do different cultural values or even models of agency inform this type of folk beliefs? And so this is something that I've thought about for a while, in part because in some of my other work, for instance, I found that it is beneficial to consider the sort of like third person outside-in perspective in your reasoning. It helps you to process information more carefully, recognize limits of your knowledge, be more open-minded when you do that. And I thought, but isn't that trivial? Isn't that just obvious that you should just, consider this type of outside perspective, and that when you're in an advisory role, you may be more likely to be open-minded? Or is it not something that everybody would agree with? And so that's where this whole project started, and then we scaled it up. And the contrast here is the following one. So for instance, when you think about how would you make a decision, especially in this context of internal versus more transactive type of approaches, ideas like exemplified in the following statement often comes to mind. This is something I found in a coffee shop in Canada. You have to get in touch with your inner guidance because it is the wisdom that knows the answers for you. It's not easy to listen to yourself when your friends and family are telling you what to do, yet all the answers to all the questions you're ever going to ask are within you now. Okay, and that may sound very humorous, and maybe some new age nonsense, coffee shops, hipsters, and so on. But it is often sort of a position that you hear, especially in Canada and in the United States, and maybe in some other countries. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have, of course, the wisdom of the crowds, where you don't at all rely on your personal opinions, but you get sort of anonymous information from the crowd and aggregate independent estimates from the crowd, where members of the crowd don't even know each other, and that go with whatever the crowd would recommend you. And so the question is, which of those is preferred, as well as other suggestions in the middle, where you may be relying on your friends and family, or maybe something else. Are you going with your intuition versus are you going with your more deliberative processes? So I thought of exploring this, and as it happens, at some point I was asked to advise a large consortium set together by Stephen Stitch, Clark Barrett, and Edouard Machery in different parts of the world, with the representatives from a wide number of countries. Unfortunately, Israel was not part of it at that stage. I don't think it ever was, but maybe for the future iteration of that. And we ended up recruiting a range of people, some of them students, some of them non-students, different languages, to participate in a study, a vignette-based study. So that's a limitation, but it is about preferences. So it is okay, I think, if it is hypothetical. Obviously, it's a limitation here. Of the following type. So we have 6 vignettes. For each vignette, we have 4 decision-making strategies. 2 of them are internal, focusing either on deliberation versus intuition. 2 of them are external. Either you go with whatever your friends and family recommend, or you even go with the wisdom of crowd. We described what that means in particular. We didn't use that term, of course. And we ask people for each of those, well, which one is wiser? Pick. And so this is a kind of a forced choice out of the four. Avoid some of the response biases if you use a scale. Which one would you pick? And which one would people from your culture choose? So to get at the descriptive norm. And on top of that, we did not only ask that, but we also used a scale to indicate which one would maximize the subjective utility. Make them, where would they be happiest in which of the strategies? And they rated each strategy on a 1 to 7 scale. In addition to that, we measured individualism and collectivism, using some of the scales that exist for that, need for cognition to see about get an insight into cognitive style preferences, and as I said, this kind of perceived utility of a given strategy. So let me give you a sense of what exactly we did. So there are several 6 scenarios. Some of them are self-protective, others are civic-minded. Some of them, and sort of like you pitch, like it's a dilemma essentially between choosing something that would benefit you at the expense of the community, helping your neighbor, for instance, versus helping yourself. And it's kind of, both are important. Or it is a choice between equally attractive options. So for instance, where would you go on vacation? Which seeds would you pick for your field and stuff like that? How would you go about that? So not all of it is just, it's not just social versus non-social. Some of it is really about personal preferences. Let me give you an example of a scenario that we used in all regions. And it is a scenario that was specifically designed in collaboration with people in South America, with our anthropology colleagues, in order to capture something that would be meaningful for that region, agricultural scenario. Okay, so it goes like that. Carlos is a young man, asks Marcus, his neighbor, if he can help him prepare his field to be able to plant before the rainy season. And Marcus has already started working in his field a few weeks ago and knows that if he helps his neighbor Carlos, he will not be able to finish all the remaining work on time, and his harvest will not be as abundant as expected. And so the question there would be, and so this is an example of, by the way, this self-protective versus social norm. We had several of those, and as I said, others are not about self versus social, but it's about 2 equally attractive options. So the questions are, what do we know about good decisions in this context? And how would you go about this? And we give people 4 different scenarios. First, Marcus could spend time reasoning and reflecting on the situation on his own. Reasons about the situation, personal experiences, his thoughts, and makes the decision based on the thoughts and reasoning. And here's an important part. Even if it doesn't align with his gut feeling or with what others may think about the situation. So you're really exclusively reasoning, irrespective of the intuition, irrespective of the external advice. Second, Marcus spends time tuning into his feelings and emotions about the situation on his own. He attends to his gut feelings about the situation, his personal experiences, his emotions, and makes a decision based on his gut feeling, even if it doesn't align with his thoughts and reasoning or with what others may think about the situation. Okay, so then 2 external, spends time getting the opinions of his friends about the situation, describes the situation to his friends listen and offer advice. The advice his friends give about the situation varies, and makes a decision based on the friend's advice, even if it doesn't align with his thoughts and reasoning or with his gut feeling about the situation. And finally, wisdom of crowds. Marcus spends some time getting the opinions of a number of strangers about the situation. Marcus posts anonymous questions online describing the situation. People read about the situation and offer advice. The advice these people give about the situation varies. So again, like this is sort of about classic wisdom of crowd, where opinions are independent from each other. Marcus then makes this decision based on the stranger's most common advice, even if it doesn't align with his thoughts and reasoning, or with his gut feeling about the situation. So here are the four possible answers. You pick which one you think is wisest. You pick which one you think is your personal preference. You pick which one do you think most people from your cultural group would pick, and do it for each of the 6 scenarios. So let's take a look at the results that totally violated what I thought would happen here, because I thought it would be a really beautiful cultural differences. And though we observed some cultural differences, they were not quite what I expected. Okay, so what do we see here? This is just probability of choosing each of these strategies by country, by sample. And what you can see here is that deliberation and intuition together heavily dominate in every single society. We go from Slovakia to South Africa in English, and all the way to China. But even in China, the majority would pick these kind of internal predominantly deliberation strategies over friends' advice and wisdom of crowd. And if you want to plot it slightly differently, so we just would look at probability of choosing internal. So this is their deliberation and intuition over external strategies. And it looks like this, where close to 70% at least, and all the way up to almost 90% of Slovakia pick internal options for themselves. The results, by the way, look almost identical if I ask about wisdom. This is about personal preference. But they look somewhat different when we look at what do they think the others in the country would pick. And so here's an example in almost all groups, and this is the groups from study 1. The only exception here is an extra sample that I will talk about later from a small-scale society. In all the groups that we tested, people are more likely, they're more likely to pick internal strategy for themselves than think that others in their society would pick. So here, what we see here is like this red dot is what would you pick? And then the blue dot is which strategy are others in your society or in your cultural group likely to use? And you see like this is a very systematic difference. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's larger, but even though, for instance, for South Africa or Ecuador or South Korea, they think, or even India potentially, they think that most people would be at parity, 50-50, internal versus external. They personally would much more likely to pick the internal strategies, which is, I find, kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the first study we did, and I'll return to the question about individual differences as well as cultural differences based on value orientation in a second. But before that, I want to address one limitation here. So we thought a little bit about this, and then we realized that maybe we screwed it up a little bit, because some of the scenarios, well, I mean, we don't know, but some of the scenarios, the way how we describe the strategies by saying you do this and you ignore all those other things, that could be viewed as artificial. And maybe it's this omission or you're forcing to omit that those other sources of information that is driving those effects. And maybe if you omit internal information, that is much more important than if you omit the external information. That's why people pick internal strategies, because you omit the external information. Well, is that sort of like, so maybe it's an artifact. So we decided to rerun it, and we reran it in a similar context, but we omitted these pieces of information. So we now just present information what you do and not what you don't do. We just leave it up to participants. So that is much more naturalistic. We're dealing with 4 vignettes to just reduce the burden a little bit. Specifically, we reran the study in a Spanish-speaking part of Peru. Then we have Canadian Canadians from who are not students. And then we have students from Morocco. And we have a Zulu population from South Africa, so indigenous population from here, and Hindi and Mandarin speakers from India and China, respectively. And so when we look at results, well, it's very similar. So the only thing where it sort of got almost to parity maybe is India now, but it is, I believe we used an MTurk sample there, so I don't know how much I trust that one. The MTurk samples from India are sometimes problematic. In part because not everybody in India speaks Hindi, even though they pretend like they do. It certainly is not a native language for people in the south of India. But overall, the pattern of result, very, very similar, close to identical to what we saw before. The majority of the people pick this internal strategies over external strategies. And then we thought, okay, well, that's fine, but why don't we, this is also just the industrialized or even post-industrial nations. So how about we expand it even further and take a look at small-scale societies? So we had some anthropologists on our team, and we decided to explore 3 groups. So we have Shiviar speakers and Shipibo speakers from Peru and Ecuador, or Ecuador and Peru. And then we also had a small group of Metai, which is kind of like a, they were from Delhi mostly, where they would be considered a minority, a less educated minority. And when we, for these groups, this was actually, especially for Shiviar and Shipibo, these were not questionnaires, of course, because these are not literate groups. We had an interpreter who would be reading out these scenarios and asking them to choose. And when we did that, we obviously had to reduce the number of stories. So we only presented 2 stories, including the Marcus story that I shared with you earlier. And the results look very similar. Once again, the majority of the people, both in Ecuador and in Peru, or Shipibo, as well as in India, pick the deliberation and gut feeling strategies. Even though sort of there's a bit of a switch, as you can see, depending on the group, whether people go with the gut feeling or if they go with deliberation. But altogether, they dominate over these external strategies. And I think that's kind of quite interesting. Again, if you do it in terms of just this internal versus external, we see that the majority of the individuals go above 50%, have a clear-cut preference. I would not necessarily pay attention to the confidence interval for my type from India, given that it's only 39 people. Okay, so that was just like the first shocking finding here. And the other interesting thing is that we looked at the degree of variability between the situations, between countries, and between individuals. And it was really heavily driven by situation-specific and particularly person-specific variance, and to a much lesser extent by country-specific variance. So variability between countries was smaller than the variability between situations, and certainly between individuals. And what was really interesting is that we did observe fairly systematic variability in terms of individualist values, as well as this kind of expected utility being associated with more internal preferences. Let me unpack this a little bit. So we have this metrics of individualism and collectivism, need for cognition. We also looked at some metacognitive processes. So to what extent, when you're reasoning about this and other situations, do you adopt this kind of outsider perspective versus insider perspective, focus on resolution and so on. And we added in one model sample specific to explain sample differences, because there were some differences between samples, as you saw. This is sample level variables, and we found some beautiful results both for individualism and collectivism going in different directions, as well as outsider view. So the more individualist you are, the more you are to pick internal preferences. More collectivist, the less likely. The more outside of you preference people have on average in a given sample. This is sample level variability. The less likely you are to pick internal preferences. But then on top of that, we also found person level effects, and they were equally, if not more pronounced. And they, on top of that, we found a need for cognition effect, that people with high need for cognition, they preferred internal strategies more. By the way, when we split it, look separately for deliberation versus intuition, as you would expect, people with high need for cognition were more likely to pick deliberation. But there were no systematic differences for picking deliberation versus intuition by individualism or this type of outside of you. So that was sort of my first example. And maybe let's quickly check if you guys have any questions about this so far, because I spoke a lot. I want to give you a moment to think, and then I will continue with another domain. There's one question in the chat, if these are all students, and the answer is no. In some societies, there were students. In some societies, there were not students. Coding, whether it was students, not student, didn't really affect the results as much. And keep in mind, we have representatives of uneducated small-scale societies from South America who showed a fairly similar overall tendency. Any other clarification questions yet? Otherwise, I will continue to the next part. I'll give a second to people. Okay. Well, you can always put it in the chat. So the other example that I want to focus on is what are the sources of external sources of judgment. So when we say, okay, I want to go with expert advice on a particular topic to make a decision, whom would I go with and why? And this is the work that was recently featured in Edge Communication. So like a lot of this stuff, including more technical details that go beyond what I can present in 45 minutes in there. This work is, the heavy lifting was done by Maxim Rudnev, who, by the way, is in the job market. It's fantastic, one of the leading specialists in cross-cultural methods. And again, it was in collaboration with Geography of Philosophy, a separate project, so different participants, but similar countries. Okay, so how did we start here? The research question was the following one. What do we know about how people make decisions? What they would consider to be the wise source of judgment? And turns out research on this topic is either limited or psychometrically misguided or both. So even though we have over 70 years of research on social judgment, it's often either focusing on a few countries, mostly Europe and North America. Sometimes Israel is part of the equation. If you look across different studies, you, on the one hand, see that there is a convergence on either so-called agentic and socio-emotional competences. Sometimes they're also described as either agency and communion or competence and warmth, even though it's kind of weird. I thought that, you know, socio-emotional is also a competence in its own right. And anyway, so that work is out there, but cross-cultural evidence is fairly limited. As I said, it's mostly based on countries from Europe, Poland, Germany, UK to some extent, sometimes occasional Southern European countries, very little from South America, virtually nothing from Africa, nothing from Southeast Asia. And the second question there is like, well, how many dimensions do we actually have? And is it about social perception? Is it about perception of minds, competent minds, and so on? And if you look across that literature, there's a whole range of propositions, and it's actually not as clear-cut. As I said, psychometrically, it's highly questionable. None of the studies that are done across studies have even attempted to establish whether the measuring tools are equivalent across different samples that they looked at, which prevents them from actually drawing any comparisons either about the means or about the relationships between variables. The majority of that work also coming from stereotype research focuses on negative stereotypes. It doesn't really look at positive competences, like whom would you go for advice? So it's kind of limited in that domain. So that was our starting point. And the essential questions were, what features would inform sources of judgment? How do they vary by culture? And how do these dimensions inform attribution of wisdom? So if I explicitly ask who is wise, what kind of underlying judgmental dimensions would you be relying on for making that decision? And does this vary across cultures? Like, again, a big question. On top of that, we looked at understanding and knowledgeability. Whom would you attribute greater knowledge and greater understanding? So, and this is a large cross-cultural endeavor. We have 16 sites from different parts of the world. And in fact, for instance, from South Africa, we even tried multiple sites, as well as from India, different languages. As you know, Afrikaans is the one spoken by during the apartheid by the minority. Zulu and Sepedi are the indigenous languages, and so on. Now, this is a convenience sample, heavily dominated by students, but not only, especially Zulu and Sepedi, not necessarily students. My Thai and Tamil were also not necessarily students, but it is a convenience sample, just something to keep in mind. Okay, so how did we go about addressing this question? So we want to know what are the latent dimensions and how they related to attribution of this kind of positive competences of the person you would go for advice. Here's an example, and this was borrowed to some extent from research on mind perception by Gray and Wagner that appeared in Science over a decade ago, even though their methodological analysis were not quite up to modern standards, but the approach itself was quite interesting. So essentially what we have here is we ask people to imagine a certain person. Often the people whom we ask them to think about would be associated with wisdom one way or another. So for instance, a 75-year-old person who has a lot of life experience, many stories to share, or a politician who tries to improve the human condition, or a scientist who tries to understand the mysteries of nature and so on. And then they would contrast that person with somebody else. In this case, in this example, it's you, your reference point, but it could also be a politician versus teacher, 75-year-old versus another baseline comparison, 45-year-old, and so on. And then for each of those, there would be a rating who would be higher or lower on a set of characteristics. And we selected 19 characteristics that, according to the prior literature, are one way or another related to wise judgment or wise decisions. Okay, so that was done, as you can see, quite a number in the matrix, like 171 comparisons, with a number of comparisons to each other. To cut the number of comparisons, we, between subject assigned one of the reference groups, within subject assigned everybody else in the reference group. So like when you do two people. And then in the second part, we have 10 targets that were then rated on wisdom, knowledgeability, and understanding. So very simple question. Each of those was rated on those. So whom did we select? So as I said, like 10 targets: a fair person, medical doctor, politician, religious person, scientist, teacher, 75-year-old, and then a set of reference comparison groups, including one that we would assume is not associated with wisdom, that is a 12-year-old, somebody who's just representing a base rate 45-year-old, and you. And by the way, important thing for targets, all of those were not just like one label, a fair person, but there was really a sentence elaborating how they contribute to improve the society and so on and so forth. And characteristic ranged from sort of more social things, more emotional things, more cognitive things, self-control, but also care for others' feelings, show humility, even sort of respond with a sense of humor, things that were actually taken from existing measures of or self-report measures of wisdom or from philosophical literature. Okay, so how did we analyze this? Essentially, we have this set of reference targets that we would compare to each other. And as I said, one of them is between subject assigned, the other one is within subject assigned. And what we can do there is multi-level, multi-group factor analysis to identify existing factors. And also, because of this multi-level structure, we can separate within individual level from between individual level of analysis. It allows us to control for response bias, which would only appear on the between individual level. And we can test now the invariance across sites. And so after a lot of sort of testing of different configurations, we had like 2 factors, 3 factors, 4 factors, 5 factors, and so on and so forth. We identified that actually a 2-factor solution worked the best across societies, and one of them was sort of associated with reflective orientation, one with socio-emotional awareness. To be more concrete, so here's the reflective dimension with the highest loadings. These are unstandardized coefficients, where you can see that they mostly load on this kind of logical thinking, acting before speaking, applying what you've learned from experience, and so on. And less so, for instance, focusing on others' expressions or focusing on the group. And socio-emotional, where the highest loadings are focusing on others' feelings, consider somebody else's perspective, and so on and so forth. Pay attention to what the emotions are telling them. And what's interesting also, show humility was loading here. I expected it to load more on the reflective. If you wanted presented differently, here the strength of the association is represented by the thickness. You see that there's a clear-cut distinction between these 2 factors in this kind of network representation that also demonstrates how they would be related to each other. What's really important is that we did achieve a partial metric invariance, which suggests that if you free the loading just for 3 items, we can actually compare the means between and the loadings between different groups, which was very, very important for us because we wanted to ultimately get to something like this, where this is just overall, and then I'll show it to you by country. So this is, by the way, one really interesting observation about your self-reference. So on the x-axis, you see reflective orientation, and on the y-axis, you see socio-emotional awareness. And the highest groups with respect to rating of targets wisdom, which would be sort of the green, would be those people who have both, even though it seems like it's more skewed towards reflective orientation than socio-emotional. So doctors, teachers, scientists, 75-year-olds are rated as wisest and sort of imbued with both of those characteristics. But one interesting observation, and a 12-year-old, as you would expect, has little of both compared to others. But what's really interesting is that a look at where U is located relative to all others sort of targets that you would normally understand as wise, potentially, according to sort of historical archetype. And a look at how U is related to that on the reflective dimension, socio-emotional. So on the reflective dimension, most of those targets, all of those targets actually, except for religious person, are viewed as more reflective than you, right? But on the socio-emotional, only a few targets, namely fair person and the teacher, are considered to have higher socio-emotional awareness than yourself, which is quite interesting in its own right. Cross-culturally, here the vertical ticks are sample-specific means, and you see it's really beautiful how systematic attribution of wisdom is, and also a very similar pattern of what I showed to you before across societies, even though there are some cultural differences. And finally, the person who would be attributed greatest wisdom would be the person who would have highest reflective orientation, and at the same time would be one standard deviation, or in this case, actually 2 standard deviations above the mean on socio-emotional characteristics as well. That's specifically that yellow line, whereas the purple, the line itself is purple, but it's yellow band around it. Where the line is yellow, but the band is purple, that's 2 standard deviations below, and you see that the effect is a bit small in terms of attribution of wisdom. In short, you need both characteristics. People perceive that you need both characteristics in order to really attribute some wisdom to individuals. So just to wrap up this part, and I realize that I'm probably coming to the end, I will not talk much about different types of deliberation, just so we can have a bit of a discussion. In this segment, I also showed that it seems like there are 2 different dimensions of perceptions whom you would be relying on for wisdom or for good judgment, namely reflective orientation, socio-emotional awareness. They seem to be also quite invariant across cultures. And robust also, by the way, when we use subsets of data, excluding age-related targets. And there are additive effects. In fact, there's also an interaction effect, even though it's somewhat less robust when we use lasso regressions. And as I said, like one really interesting side note is that U is perceived as less reflective, but more socio-emotionally aware than most wisdom exemplars that we used here, which I think is interesting in its own right and consistent with some other existing literature. Okay, as I said, I probably will skip this next part for the sake of time. I have a lot to talk about, and this is really a passion project of mine about different forms of deliberation. If you want to know more, check out the Science Advanced paper that came out during the pandemic, so nobody paid attention to it. But I think it's a really interesting work on different types of deliberation. Instead of that, I will just quickly fast forward to the end, and then we can have a discussion. Okay, so I talked about several examples of what could be considered aspects of meta judgment. Specifically, I focused on whether people focus on internal processes versus transactive processes, and whom would they pick for the transactive processes? Do they go more with agency to some extent, or do they go with a communion? But obviously, there are many other features. This is just some examples, and would be really interesting to map them out and have really a systematic way to examine what kind of folk theories do we rely on, and how systematic is it? How do we switch from one context to another? Something that we actually have done in a realm of rational versus reasonable, which I didn't present yet, but we can talk about that in the discussion. The other question here is that why is there greater variability across persons and situations compared to across cultures? So far, even though I started being a culturally minded psychologist with these differences or the assumption of differences, instead of that, I present to you 2 examples where effects were actually fairly systematic. One speculative conjecture here is that, well, first of all, I have to admit, I have no idea. Maybe we don't use the right samples. Maybe some of them are too educated. Maybe we are not sensitive enough to what really are the features of good judgment or wise judgment for individuals in different societies. We need other methods. We need better tools. And that's something we are trying to work on in the Wise Judgment Consortium. But that's one explanation that is just basically our fault. and limits of our methods. Another speculation is that it could be that there are different judgmental standards suited for coping with distinct adaptive challenges that may be recurrent features of human experience, and in different societies, you may find them in different niches. So for instance, when I talk about rational and reasonable, which is a bit unfair because I didn't really present this work that much, but there's a connection to when people are more likely to think about the reasonable features, namely for ill-defined open systems, as compared to rational features, so this kind of analytic top-down features for well-defined systems. Well, those type of systems, ill-defined and well-defined, are as present in Israel as they are in South Africa, and I can bet that they were as present in hunter-gatherer societies as they are in post-industrial nations. We always have some decisions where it is very messy and you cannot really apply some pseudo rules, and there are others where following some kind of a rule and doing it in a systematic fashion would be of advantage. So maybe that is one of the hand-waving explanations so far, but there's certainly much more work that is needed here. So this work was not possible without all the wonderful people. So I just want to highlight Richard again and Wisdom and Culture Lab members who have been working on this. And very briefly, if you're interested in the further work on judgment and understanding of folk theories of judgment across cultures, check out the Wise Judgment Consortium. If you're interested in some of the other work that I've been doing with Phil Tetlock and others, check out this new multimedia project that we put together on forecasting and futurescape, which would be a separate talk altogether. So I'll stop now and let's open the room for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now it's time for questions. If you don't have questions yet, so I will go ahead and start. How have you choose the countries to participate? Maybe I missed it, but
yeah. So well, I didn't. So the very convenient answer is I didn't. That was Edward and Steve and Clark, who through their networks in philosophy and in anthropology. I mean, Clark was just last year the president of Evolution and Human Adaptation Society. So as an anthropologist, he had a whole range of networks. For instance, his site in South America is where we got the small-scale society. So in many ways, it was convenience-based. I can tell you how I would do it if it was me choosing. I mean, so for instance, for the Wise Judgment Consortium, initially I thought of it as sort of, I mean, I think it's a very tricky question. You have to first trust colleagues that they will be able to do a good job and do it in a timely manner, because for projects of this scope, when you have, let's say, 10 to 15 sites, you got to make sure that people do it on time, which is not a given because people have different schedules, different priorities. Calendar looks very different in the Southern Hemisphere, spring versus summer versus winter, versus, and pragmatic constraints like that, funding and so on. Then there's a question, how much money do you have? And where can you go and how much would it cost? And then there's a question, well, what kind of methods are you using? And are there colleagues on those sites? It's kind of related to the question about trust, where you can assume that they would be able to apply the methods that you have, or whether you need to really teach them and do things from scratch, which becomes often much more difficult unless you take a more of an anthropological approach and sort of like really use narratives or something like that, where you don't even need sort of like the classic toolbox of psychological judgment decision-making researchers. So for instance, for my current projects for Wise Judgment Consortium, when I selected the 12 countries, it was driven by linguistic diversity, geographic representation, and then trust. Do I trust these people to do a good job? Do I have a rapport with them? Have I established connection that I can, in the worst case, call them and talk to them and figure out a way to move the project along? Very, very important. Sort of the very pragmatic, not very analytic type of concerns, but I think in the realm of this kind of large-scale cross-cultural work is very important.
Though you're a psychologist, I think it's a kind of economist way of thinking. I like it. Igor, go ahead.
Yeah, just if you can explain again, I'm not sure I understand. How do you explain the difference between your result and the old literature on collectivist versus other cultures?
On collectivist versus
Individualistic culture. So you don't find the large cultural differences, and what?
yeah.
So what's the short explanation or hypothesis?
Well, either that's it's a loaded question, and let's see among the people in the room, how politically correct do I have to be here? That's my first concern, because there's a lot of discussion right now whether those concerns about prior findings about national differences in individualism, collectivism are actually correct.
I can stop the recording if you want.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think there's a more and more conceptual and empirical papers come out that demonstrate that, well, maybe what we conceptualized even as individualism has been misconstrued. Both my former RA like Thomas Talhelm has done something about that. Kuba Chris has another paper about that. Plamen Kalivsky, who is now in Hong Kong, has done something about. Maxim Rudnev has written about that. I previously have criticized Hofstede's work, where what's really weird and bizarre about that scholarship is that those national rankings for countries, it's almost like a joke, to be honest, because it would collect then the data from Japan and the United States in the 60s, then a few other countries in the 70s, Russia in the 90s, and a few others in 2000s. So you really don't know what you're getting there. Are you even getting cross-cultural differences, or is it just like, changes over time? What is the mechanism? So very black boxy. You don't even know what exactly the measuring tools. It's a known secret, which is kind of that almost all existing measures of individualism, collectivism don't meet the bar of psychometric research. Single scale, you can't even get a Cronbach alpha right. Like the most of the time, it's like a 0.5 or 0.6 on Cronbach alpha, which is unacceptable. And Cronbach alpha is not even, or alpha is not even something you should be aspiring for doing. I mean, you really need to do this measurement and variance work. So psychometrically and conceptually, there are concerns with that prior research. Now, I don't want to diss it entirely. I think what we do see here is that we used Daphne Oyserman's scale that was initially sort of developed actually for Israeli-American comparisons, if I remember correctly, for self-construal. And what we do see is that the more you endorse, the more the society endorses those values, the more they are, the individualist values, the more they are to pick internal strategies. In that sense, that's fairly consistent. It's just that mean level differences, which country do you think is more likely to be individualist versus collectivist? That does not really align with what we would a priori expect.
Yeah,
It's a lot
maybe I'll try and just
Yeah,
a long short idea.
yeah.
Do I have time, Efim, or should I get? Maybe just because it's a collectivist country, I don't want to ask other people for their opinion, because if I ask them, then I have to do it. So you have a backfiring. It's by chance cancel out.
Yeah, so we did not see much of that, but it could be to some extent. I mean, like for instance, what we see is like so relative, absolute level on the absolute level, and that's what we describe also in the preprint. I mean, I didn't go much into that detail. On the absolute level, in most countries, even in the most collectivist countries, people pick these internal strategies. You say maybe they want to pick internal strategies for different reasons than in individualist countries. That may be true. That would require a different study. That's actually really interesting. But what I want to point out on top of that is like in addition to this absolute preference, pan-cultural absolute preference, relatively speaking, there are differences. And so those individuals and samples that tend to score higher on collectivism, they were less likely to, relatively speaking, to endorse this internal norm, essentially.
Okay, as Igor reminded me, we are unfortunately running out of time, so we will have to end the formal part now. But those of you who want to stay are more than welcome to stay for our informal part. And again,
Oh, and
Igor,
can I say something quickly?
definitely.
And yeah, if you guys are interested in the Wise Judgment Consortium, check out the website. We don't have partners from Israel, and we don't have extra money, but we have the infrastructure. And in case anybody wants to join, you're more welcome than welcome to join, because it would be great to have, yet another country represented, or set of countries represented.
And I added the link to the chat. I hope this is the right link.
That's right. Yeah.
Cool, great. So again, thank you. But again, we are staying for the informal part, those who want to stay. Yeah, already.